the glittering world of Monte Carlo, where opulent villas hide dark secrets, a priceless sapphire necklace, the Worthington star, vanishes from Villa Serena, sparking suspicion among a cast of intriguing guests. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, who unravels a web of greed, betrayal, and hidden motives. From a tense dinner party to a clandestine midnight meeting. Every clue, lipstick smudges, a lost cufflink, a secret ledger, leads her closer to the truth. Will she expose the thief before they escape with the treasure? Dive into a mystery in Monte Carlo, where elegance masks deception, and no secret stays buried for long. Chapter 1. An unexpected invitation. The late September light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest sitting room in Chipping Norton, a village of such unassuming charm that its cobblestone lanes and ivy-clad cottages seemed to whisper of timeless tranquility. Miss Marple, with her soft white hair neatly pinned and her hands deftly manoeuvring her knitting needles, sat by the window, her eyes occasionally drifting to the garden where dahlias nodded in the breeze. She was not one for idleness, but the rhythm of her needles allowed her mind to wander, picking apart the threads of village gossip as skillfully as she unravelled a knot in her wool. On this particular morning, the postman's arrival interrupted her reverie. Among the usual bills and circulars lay an envelope of uncommon elegance, cream vellum, embossed with a gilded crest and addressed in a looping, confident hand. The postmark read Monte Carlo, a place so far removed from Chipping Norton's quiet rhythms that Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. She opened it with care, her small, precise movements betraying none of the curiosity that stirred within her. The letter was from Lady Beatrice Worthington, a name that stirred faint memories of school days long past, when Beatrice, then plain Miss Harrow, had been a lively girl, with a penchant for dramatic gestures. Now, a widow of considerable means, Lady Beatrice wrote with warmth but an undercurrent of urgency, inviting Miss Marple to her villa in Monte Carlo for a fortnight. The invitation was phrased with the sort of vague politeness that hinted at more than a social whim. Your presence, dear Jane, with your keen insight and discretion, would be a comfort in a matter I cannot yet put to paper. Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully, her mind already turning over possibilities. A holiday, yes, but one with a puzzle she suspected. She accepted, of course. To decline would have been to deny her own nature, for Miss Marple, though fond of her garden and her village, was never one to shy away from the intricacies of human behaviour, wherever they might unfold. She packed her suitcase with her usual practicality. Several sensible tweed skirts, a cardigan or two, a single evening dress of understated elegance, and her knitting, which accompanied her everywhere like a faithful companion. The journey began with a train to London, where the bustle of the station and the cries of porters felt like the opening notes of an unfamiliar symphony. From there, a steamer carried her across the Channel to the French Riviera, its decks alive with passengers whose faces Miss Marple studied with quiet interest. Among them was a young man, no older than 30, with a thin face and eyes that darted like a cornered creature's. He clutched his suitcase too tightly, his fingers betraying a nervous energy that Miss Marple noted without comment. Nearby, a woman of striking beauty, swathed in furs despite the mild weather, laughed loudly at her own witticisms, a theatrical sort, Miss Marple decided, likely an actress accustomed to commanding attention. A third figure caught her eye. A gentleman with a military bearing, his moustache impeccably trimmed, his posture rigid as though still on parade. He stared out at the sea with a frown, lost in thoughts that seemed far from pleasant. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing parallels in human nature, thought of Mr. Clements, the Chipping Norton grocer who fidgeted when his accounts didn't balance, and Mrs. Harroway, whose loud laughter at the Women's Institute masked a private sorrow. People, she reflected, were much the same, whether in a village shop or on a steamer bound for Monte Carlo. As the ship neared the Riviera, the coastline emerged in a haze of gold and azure, the cliffs dotted with villas that gleamed like jewels against the Mediterranean. Miss Marple felt a flicker of anticipation, not for the glamour of Monte Carlo, such things held little sway over her, but for the mystery that awaited. Lady Beatrice's letter had been too carefully worded, too laden with unspoken meaning, to suggest a mere holiday. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple's delicate fingers, still clutching her knitting, itched to unravel it. Chapter 2. The Villa Serena. The Villa Serena stood like a proud matriarch on its cliffside perch, its white stucco walls gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, with bougainvillea spilling over its terraces in vibrant cascades of magenta. To Miss Jane Marple, accustomed to the modest charms of Chipping Norton, the villa's grandeur was almost theatrical, yet she found its opulence less impressive than the subtle tensions she sensed within its walls. As her taxi wound up the narrow road from Monte Carlo's harbour, she gazed out at the sea, its surface shimmering like a sheet of sapphire, and considered the task ahead. Lady Beatrice Worthington's invitation had hinted at a delicate matter, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailties, suspected that the villa's elegance concealed a knot of secrets waiting to be untangled. Lady Beatrice greeted her at the villa's entrance. Her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her smile warm but tinged with strain. She was a woman of perhaps 60, her poise tempered by a faint tremor in her hands as she clasped Miss Marple's. "Jane, how good of you to come," she said, her voice carrying the cultured cadence of their shared youth. "I've longed for someone with your perspective." The pause was slight, but Miss Marple noted it, as she noted the quick glance Lady Beatrice cast toward the grand staircase behind her. Something or someone was troubling her hostess. The interior of Villa Serena was a study in luxury. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and French doors opened onto a terrace where the sea breeze carried the scent of jasmine. Lady Beatrice led Miss Marple to a drawing room adorned with gilt-framed paintings and plush velvet furniture, where the other guests were already assembled for tea. The group was a curious mix, each member distinct yet somehow familiar to Miss Marple, whose years in Chipping Norton had taught her that human types recurred with predictable regularity, like patterns in her knitting. Mr. Hugo Vance, a financier with a sharp jaw and sharper eyes, lounged in an armchair, his tailored suit impeccable, but his manner faintly predatory. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his smile more calculation than warmth, reminding her of Mr. Hargreaves, the Chipping Norton solicitor who always seemed to know more than he said. Beside him sat Mrs. Clara Duval, the actress from the steamer, her fur stole discarded to reveal a dress of emerald silk that clung to her curves. Her laughter was bright but brittle, and her eyes darted toward the others as if gauging their reactions. Miss Marple thought of Miss Lottie, the village dressmaker, whose flirtations masked a desperate need for admiration. Colonel Rupert Hartley, the military gentleman from the ship, stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his moustache bristling as he recounted a tale of his Indian campaigns. His voice was loud, but his eyes were wary, and Miss Marple recalled old Major Thompson, whose bluster in the village pub often hid a private grievance. Young Mr. Timothy Wren, the nervous fellow, hovered near the tea table, his fingers fidgeting with a napkin. He was pale, with a boyish face that seemed perpetually on the verge of apology, not unlike young Tommy Pierce, who had once been caught pilfering apples in Chipping Norton. Finally, there was Miss Eleanor Price, Lady Beatrice's secretary, a woman of indeterminate age with mousy hair and a quiet demeanour. Her eyes, however, were sharp, missing nothing, and Miss Marple noted their resemblance to those of Mrs. Elkins, the postmistress, who knew everyone's business but kept her own counsel. Tea was served with delicate porcelain and an array of pastries, but the conversation was stilted. Mr. Vance made a cutting remark about the extravagance of Monte Carlo's casinos, which Colonel Hartley countered with a lecture on discipline and honour. Mrs. Duval interjected with a theatrical anecdote about her latest stage triumph, while Timothy murmured vague agreements, his eyes fixed on his teacup. Miss Price, silent but attentive, refilled Lady Beatrice's cup with a precision that spoke of long practice. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the interplay with quiet interest, her mind cataloguing the glances, the hesitations, the unspoken resentments that flickered like shadows across the room. Dinner that evening was a more formal affair, held in a dining room aglow with candlelight and silver. The table was set with crystal goblets and a centerpiece of orchids, but the atmosphere was far from festive. Lady Beatrice, seated at the head, seemed distracted, her fork pausing midway to her mouth, as Mr. Vance launched into a critique of her late husband's investments. "A pity Sir Henry didn't diversify," he said, his tone smooth but edged. "One mustn't put all one's eggs in a single basket, must one?" Lady Beatrice flushed, and Miss Marple noted the tightening of her hostess's lips, a sign of suppressed anger or fear. Mrs. Duval, resplendent in a gown of scarlet taffeta, leaned toward Timothy, her voice a low purr as she complimented his tie. The young man blushed, stammering a reply, and Miss Marple wondered at the actress's motives, genuine affection or calculated charm. Colonel Hartley, meanwhile, dominated the conversation with tales of military valour, but his anecdotes were met with polite disinterest, save for a sharp retort from Mr. Vance about armchair generals. The tension was palpable, and Miss Marple, her fork poised over her sole meunière, felt the familiar prickling of her instincts. Something was amiss, and it was more than the usual frictions of a mixed house party. As the meal drew to a close, Lady Beatrice rose, her voice unsteady. "Jane, might I have a word tomorrow? There's a matter, a private matter." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but her mind alert. The other guests dispersed, Mr. Vance to the terrace with a cigar, Mrs. Duval to her room with a dramatic yawn, Colonel Hartley to the billiard room, Timothy to the gardens, and Miss Price to her office, where the clack of a typewriter soon echoed. Miss Marple retired to her own room, a charming chamber with a view of the sea, and sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The night was still, the only sound the distant lapping of waves, when a sudden scream tore through the villa. Miss Marple, never one to dither, slipped on her dressing gown and moved swiftly towards the source. The grand library, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, was in disarray. Lady Beatrice stood by a mahogany desk, her face ashen, pointing to an empty velvet case. "The Worthington Star," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My sapphire necklace! It's gone!" The other guests soon gathered, their faces a tableau of shock and suspicion. Colonel Hartley demanded immediate action. Mrs. Duval clutched her pearls. Mr. Vance's eyes narrowed. Timothy paled, and Miss Price hovered silently in the doorway. Miss Marple, her gaze sweeping the room, noted the open French doors, the faint smudge of red on the desk, and a single pearl earring glinting near a bookshelf. She said nothing, but her mind was already at work, threading together the first strands of a mystery that promised to be as intricate as the patterns she wove with her needles. Chapter 3. The Missing Star. The library of Villa Serena, bathed in the pale moonlight that streamed through its open French doors, was a scene of controlled chaos. The empty velvet case, which had once cradled the Worthington Star, lay forlorn on the mahogany desk, its sapphire blue lining a mocking reminder of the treasure it no longer held. Lady Beatrice Worthington, her hands clasped tightly to still their trembling, stood at the centre of the gathered guests, her eyes darting from one face to another as though searching for answers in their expressions. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, surveyed the room with the quiet precision of one accustomed to unravelling the tangles of human deceit. "The Worthington Star," Lady Beatrice explained in a voice that wavered only slightly, "was no mere bauble. A necklace of flawless sapphires, each stone the size of a robin's egg. It had been a gift from her late husband's family, passed down through generations and valued not only for its beauty, but for its history. Its impending auction, planned for a charity gala in Monte Carlo, was to be a crowning moment in Lady Beatrice's social calendar. Its theft, however, threatened not just financial loss, but a scandal that could tarnish her carefully curated reputation. "It was here this afternoon," she said, gesturing to the case. "I checked it myself before tea." Colonel Rupert Hartley, his moustache bristling with indignation, was the first to speak. "This is an outrage. We must summon the Monte Carlo police at once." His tone was that of a man accustomed to issuing orders, but Miss Marple noted the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes, as though he feared the scrutiny a police investigation might bring. Lady Beatrice hesitated, her lips parting as if to protest, and Miss Marple, with her gentle but firm authority, interposed. "Perhaps before we involve the authorities, we might examine the scene ourselves. A few careful observations may spare unnecessary publicity." The guests, though visibly reluctant, acquiesced. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small figure almost lost in the grandeur of the library, yet her presence commanded attention. She bent over the desk, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The smudge of red lipstick, vivid against the polished wood, caught her attention first. It was a shade too bold for Lady Beatrice's refined taste, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to Mrs. Clara Duval's scarlet-painted lips at dinner. Near the bookshelf, The pearl earring gleamed, its delicate design suggesting a woman of means. Yet Mrs. Duval, for all her flamboyance, had worn no such earrings that evening. Miss Marple filed this discrepancy away, her thoughts drifting to the village jeweller in Chipping Norton, whose lost earring had once revealed a thief among his apprentices. The French doors, ajar and swaying gently in the night breeze, suggested an intruder's entry, yet the lock bore no signs of tampering. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly along the frame, noting the absence of scratches or forced entry. "Curious," she murmured, her voice so soft that only Lady Beatrice, standing nearby, heard her. The terrace beyond was dark, its flagstones barely visible, but Miss Marple resolved to inspect it come morning. Each guest was questioned, their alibis offered with varying degrees of conviction. Mrs. Duval, her voice tinged with theatrical indignation, claimed she had been in her room, tending to her complexion with a lavender-scented face mask. "I wouldn't dream of prowling about at night," she declared, though her eyes flicked nervously toward Mr. Hugo Vance. The financier, leaning against a bookcase with studied nonchalance, said he had been on the terrace, smoking a cigar and enjoying the sea air. His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of his jaw, reminiscent of Mr. Hargreaves when questioned about a client's missing funds. Colonel Hartley asserted he had been in the billiard room, practicing shots alone, a solitary pursuit that struck Miss Marple as oddly convenient, given the room's distance from the library. Young Timothy Wren, his face pale and his hands twisting together, stammered that he had been walking in the gardens, unable to sleep. His eyes avoided Miss Price, who stood silently by the door, her expression unreadable. The secretary claimed she had been in her office, typing correspondence for Lady Beatrice, and the faint sound of a typewriter earlier that evening lent credence to her story. Yet Miss Marple, with her knack for sensing the unspoken, noted the secretary's fingers smoothing her skirt, a gesture that recalled Mrs. Elkins when she wished to deflect attention. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, urged the group to retire, promising to decide on the police by morning. The guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridors. But Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the desk. The lipstick smudge, the earring, the unforced lock, these were not random clues, but threads in a pattern, much like the intricate lace she knitted at home. She thought of Chipping Norton, where a stolen silver teapot had been traced to a maid's jealousy, and suspected that here, too, the motive lay in the quiet resentments and hidden desires of the villa's inhabitants. As she made her way to her room, Miss Marple paused at a window overlooking the terrace. The Mediterranean stretched before her, its surface a mirror of stars, and she reflected on the nature of theft. In her experience, it was rarely about the object itself, but about what it represented: power, freedom, or revenge. The Worthington Star, with its glittering legacy, was a prize that might tempt any number of sins. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once dismissed her village analogies as quaint, only to be proven wrong when a Chipping Norton scandal mirrored a London intrigue. Human nature, she mused, was a universal constant, whether in a cottage or a cliffside villa. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the open window, her knitting untouched in her lap. The scream, the missing necklace, the uneasy alibis, They formed the opening bars of a symphony she had heard before, though the players were new. She thought of Lady Beatrice's strained smile, Mr. Vance's calculating gaze, Mrs. Duval's theatricality, Colonel Hartley's bluster, Timothy's nerves, and Miss Price's watchful silence. Each was a piece in the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, knew that the truth would emerge not through haste, but through careful observation. As the villa settled into an uneasy silence, she closed her eyes, her mind already weaving the first strands of a solution, as deftly as her needles wove wool into patterns back in Chipping Norton. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Casino. The morning after the theft of the Worthington Star dawned bright and clear, the Mediterranean sparkling with an almost insolent cheerfulness that belied the tension within Villa Serena. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, took her breakfast on the terrace, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon while her mind sifted through the events of the previous night. The lipstick smudge, the pearl earring, the unforced lock, these were not mere clues but signposts, pointing to a truth as yet obscured by the villa's glittering facade. She sipped her tea, its warmth a small comfort, and resolved to observe the guests with renewed vigilance. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, announced that the day's plans would proceed as intended. An evening at Monte Carlo's famed casino, a social obligation tied to the upcoming charity gala. Miss Marple, though no gambler, agreed to join, sensing that the casino's heady atmosphere might loosen tongues and reveal more than the library had. The guests, too, seemed eager to escape the villa's oppressive air, though their reasons, Miss Marple suspected, varied as widely as their characters. The casino, a palace of marble and gold, thrummed with life as the party arrived that evening. Chandeliers cast a dazzling glow over roulette wheels and baccarat tables, where fortunes changed hands with the flick of a card. Miss Marple, in her modest evening dress, felt like a sparrow among peacocks, yet her unassuming presence allowed her to move unnoticed through the crowd. She declined to play, preferring to watch from a velvet-upholstered bench, her knitting in her lap as a pretext for her keen observation. Mrs. Clara Duval, radiant in scarlet silk, held court at a roulette table, her laughter ringing out as she placed extravagant bets. Her gaiety, however, seemed forced, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted toward Mr. Hugo Vance, who stood nearby, his expression one of cool appraisal. The financier, impeccably tailored, moved among the tables with the confidence of a man accustomed to winning, yet his smile never reached his eyes. Colonel Rupert Hartley, by contrast, was a study in frustration, his bets at the blackjack table growing reckless as his losses mounted. Miss Marple thought of old Mr. Grayson in Chipping Norton, whose temper flared when his luck turned sour at the village whist drives. Young Timothy Wren lingered near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne with the air of someone who wished to be elsewhere. His nervous glances toward the gaming floor suggested a man out of his depth, and Miss Marple recalled young Tommy Pierce, who had once gambled his week's wages on a horse race and spent days avoiding the village. Miss Eleanor Price, the secretary, surprised Miss Marple by joining a baccarat game, her quiet competence at odds with her usual reserve. Her hands moved with precision, and her small stack of chips grew steadily, a detail that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Elkins, whose meticulous accounting at the post office hid a shrewd mind. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a croupier, a wiry man with a quick smile, who seemed unusually attentive to Mr. Vance. During a lull, she engaged him in polite conversation, her questions innocent but probing. "Such a lively place," she remarked, her needles clicking softly. "I suppose you see all sorts here, even in the private rooms?" The croupier's smile faltered, but he let slip that Mr. Vance had been seen arguing with a gentleman of questionable repute in a private salon the previous week. When Miss Marple pressed for details, he excused himself, his discomfort evident. She made a mental note, her thoughts circling back to Mr. Vance's sharp words at dinner and the smudge of lipstick in the library. Her observations were interrupted by a small commotion at the bar. Timothy Wren, his face flushed, had dropped a folded note, which a waiter swiftly retrieved and slipped into his pocket before vanishing into the crowd. Miss Marple, her view partially obscured, caught only a glimpse of the exchange, but it was enough to pique her curiosity. Was Timothy passing messages, and if so, to whom? She thought of the village postman in Chipping Norton, whose careless handling of a letter had once revealed a clandestine affair. As the party prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered near Mrs. Duval, who was adjusting her stole with exaggerated care. "Such excitement," Miss Marple said mildly, gesturing to the casino, "though I imagine it pales compared to the stage." Mrs. Duval's laugh was a touch too loud, and her reply, a vague tale of a Paris performance, lacked her usual flair. Miss Marple noted the actress's smudged lipstick, a shade remarkably similar to the mark on the library desk, and wondered if her evening had been spent entirely at the roulette table. Back at the villa, the guests retired with strained good nights, their earlier camaraderie eroded by suspicion. Miss Marple, however, found herself approached by Miss Price, who lingered in the corridor outside her room. "I couldn't help overhearing something troubling," the secretary said, her voice low. "Mr. Vance was speaking to Lady Beatrice this afternoon, something about a debt she owed him." He sounded threatening. Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly before dropping to the floor, and Miss Marple noted the nervous twist of her hands, so like Mrs. Elkins when she had something to hide. "Thank you, Miss Price," Miss Marple said gently. "You've been most helpful." As the secretary retreated, Miss Marple considered her words. Was Miss Price genuinely concerned, or was she planting seeds of suspicion? The casino had revealed much. Mr. Vance's shady connections, Timothy's secretive note, Mrs. Duval's unease, Colonel Hartley's losses, and Miss Price's unexpected skill at cards. But it had answered little. The Worthington Star remained missing, and the web of motives grew ever more tangled. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the sea a dark expanse beyond. She thought of Chipping Norton, where a stolen brooch had been traced to a jealous housemaid, and reflected that the villa's guests, for all their sophistication, were driven by the same passions: greed, fear, ambition. The croupier's gossip, the note at the bar, the secretary's whispered confidence. These were threads in a pattern, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, knew that patience would bring them into focus. As the villa slept, she resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the questions that danced in her mind, each one a step closer to the truth. Chapter 5. A Discovery in the Garden. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Villa Serena, where the scent of roses mingled with the salt tang of the Mediterranean. Miss Jane Marple, never one to linger in bed, had risen early to explore the grounds, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel paths. The theft of the Worthington Star had stirred the household into a state of uneasy watchfulness, and Miss Marple, with her knack for uncovering truths in the smallest details, felt that the gardens might hold secrets the library had not revealed. Her tweed skirt brushed against lavender bushes as she moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the earth for anything out of place. The villa's gardens were a masterpiece of design, with manicured hedges and marble fountains that spoke of wealth and care. Yet Miss Marple's interest lay not in their beauty, but in their hidden corners. Near a bed of crimson roses, she paused, her sharp gaze catching a glint of metal half buried in the soil. Stooping with the ease of one accustomed to such investigations, she retrieved a silver cufflink, its surface engraved with the initials HV. She turned it over in her hand, recalling Mr. Hugo Vance's monogrammed cuffs at dinner, polished, ostentatious, and now it seemed carelessly lost. The discovery was no accident, she thought, for it suggested a presence in the garden on the night of the theft, a presence Mr. Vance had not mentioned in his alibi of smoking on the terrace. Further along the path, near a stone bench overlooking the sea, Miss Marple spotted a scrap of paper caught in the thorns of a rosebush. She extracted it carefully, noting its torn edge and the hasty scrawl in black ink, "Midnight and Terrace." The words were cryptic, but their implication was clear. A clandestine meeting, perhaps tied to the necklace's disappearance. Miss Marple slipped the cufflink and paper into her pocket, her mind already weaving connections to the smudge of lipstick and the pearl earring in the library. In Chipping Norton, a torn letter found in a hedgerow had once led to the exposure of a petty thief. Here the stakes were higher, but the principle remained the same. At luncheon, the atmosphere in the dining room was strained, the clink of cutlery against porcelain, a stark contrast to the previous evening's forced gaiety. Lady Beatrice, her eyes shadowed, picked at her salad, while the guests exchanged polite but guarded remarks. Miss Marple, seated beside Colonel Rupert Hartley, chose her moment carefully. "I found the most curious thing in the garden this morning," she said, her voice mild as she produced the cufflink. "A monogrammed piece, HV, I believe. Do you suppose it belongs to anyone here?" Mr. Vance's fork paused, and a flush crept up his neck, though he recovered quickly. "Mine, I expect," he said, his tone casual. "I must have dropped it days ago. Careless of me." His eyes, however, darted to Colonel Hartley, who was slicing his chicken with a vigour that suggested suppressed anger. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her thoughts drifting to a Chipping Norton farmer, whose lost button had betrayed his presence at a stolen harvest. Mrs. Clara Duval, her lipstick freshly applied but slightly uneven, offered a bright smile that faltered when Miss Marple mentioned the garden's beauty. "I never walk there," she said quickly. "Too many thorns for my liking." Timothy Wren excused himself abruptly, claiming a headache, while Miss Eleanor Price, the secretary, spilled a drop of wine, her hand trembling as Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. After luncheon, Lady Beatrice drew Miss Marple aside in the drawing-room, her voice low and urgent. "Jane, I must confide in you," she said, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "The Worthington Star is insured, of course, but its loss is more than financial. My reputation in Monte Carlo, my position, depends on that, Gala. And there's more." She hesitated, then confessed that she owed Mr. Vance a substantial sum from a failed investment in a shipping venture. "He's been pressing me to sell the necklace privately to settle it," she admitted. "I refused, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple, with her gentle nod, encouraged her to continue. Lady Beatrice's admission cast a new light on Mr. Vance's sharp words and the cufflink's presence in the garden. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, strolling the villa's corridors and pausing at windows to gaze at the sea. The cufflink and the torn note were tangible clues, but it was the undercurrents of the household that intrigued her most. Mr. Vance's financial hold over Lady Beatrice suggested a motive for theft, yet his polished demeanour hinted at a more calculated plan. Mrs. Duval's unease, Timothy's nerves, Colonel Hartley's irritability, and Miss Price's watchful silence. All were threads in a tapestry that Miss Marple was beginning to discern. She thought of a Chipping Norton scandal, where a missing silver tray had been traced to a butler's grudge, and wondered if the Worthington Star's theft was similarly rooted in personal resentments. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to the garden, her steps slow but deliberate. The terrace, mentioned in the note, was a broad expanse of stone overlooking the cliffs, its balustrade lined with potted geraniums. She examined it closely, noting scuff marks on the flagstones, faint but suggestive of hurried movement. The terrace's proximity to the library's French doors made it a likely route for an intruder, or perhaps an insider posing as one. Miss Marple's mind turned to the lipstick smudge and the earring, both pointing to a woman's involvement, yet the cufflink implicated a man. The puzzle was complex, but Miss Marple, with her years of observing human nature, knew that complexity often masked simple truths. Back in her room, she sat by the window, the sea a dark mirror under the rising moon. The villa's guests, for all their sophistication, were no different from the villagers of Chipping Norton, driven by desires and fears as old as time. The cufflink, the note, Lady Beatrice's debt, these were pieces of a pattern. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, felt the shape of it emerging. She resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a steady rhythm against the night silence, her thoughts weaving a net that would soon ensnare the truth. Chapter 6. The Midnight Meeting. The night was warm, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and the distant murmur of the sea. As Miss Jane Marple positioned herself behind a heavy damask curtain in Villa Serena's drawing-room, the terrace beyond, bathed in moonlight, was the stage for a meeting hinted at by the torn scrap of paper she had found in the garden. The words midnight and terrace had lodged in her mind, and though she had no taste for eavesdropping, Miss Marple knew that secrets whispered in the dark often held the key to daylight's mysteries. Her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. She stood motionless, her small figure blending into the shadows, her senses attuned to every sound. The villa was quiet, its guests ostensibly retired, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that sleep was far from their minds. The theft of the Worthington Star had cast a pall over the household, and the threads of suspicion, Mr. Vance's cufflink, Mrs. Duval's lipstick, the pearl earring, Timothy's nerves, Miss Price's watchfulness, were weaving a pattern she could almost discern. The midnight hour approached, and as the clock in the hall chimed softly, two figures emerged onto the terrace, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlit sea. Miss Marple recognized them at once. Timothy Wren, his thin frame hunched as though bearing an invisible weight, and Miss Eleanor Price, her movements precise, yet betraying a hint of urgency. They stood close, their voices low, and Miss Marple strained to catch their words. "The necklace," Timothy murmured, his tone anxious. "It's too risky now." Miss Price's reply was sharper, though still a whisper. "Tomorrow night, then. No mistakes." The conversation was brief, fragmented by the breeze, but Miss Marple caught the word safe and saw Timothy fumble with something in his pocket. A small object that glinted briefly before he clutched it tightly and slipped it away. A key, she thought, her mind flashing to the locked drawers and hidden compartments of Chipping Norton's vicarage, where a stolen hymn book had once been concealed. As the pair parted, Timothy heading toward the garden and Miss Price retreating into the villa, Miss Marple remained still, her thoughts racing. The key suggested a hiding place, perhaps for the necklace itself, and the urgency of their exchange hinted at a plan nearing its climax. She recalled a Chipping Norton grocer's boy, caught passing notes for a poacher, and wondered if Timothy was an unwitting pawn or a willing accomplice. Miss Price's commanding tone, so at odds with her mousy demeanour, suggested a mind more calculating than she let on. The next morning, Miss Marple observed the household with renewed focus. At breakfast, Timothy avoided Miss Price's gaze, his fingers shredding a piece of toast as he stared at his plate. Mrs. Clara Duval, her makeup impeccable but her eyes shadowed, announced her intention to leave for Paris the following day, claiming Monte Carlo had grown tiresome. Her departure, Miss Marple noted, coincided with the tomorrow night mentioned on the terrace, and she wondered if the actress's haste was more than theatrical caprice. Colonel Rupert Hartley, meanwhile, was preoccupied, muttering about debts of honour as he stabbed at his eggs, his irritation palpable. Mr. Hugo Vance, by contrast, was all smooth charm, complimenting Lady Beatrice on the villa's hospitality, though his eyes lingered on her with a calculating intensity that reminded Miss Marple of a Chipping Norton landlord sizing up a tenant's arrears. Miss Price, serving coffee with her usual efficiency, seemed unruffled, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hand as she passed the cream. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple returned to the library after breakfast, her steps deliberate as she examined the bookshelf where the pearl earring had been found. Running her fingers along the spines, she pressed gently, and with a soft click, a panel slid open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of figures. Payments from Lady Beatrice to Mr. Vance, each entry dated and initialed. The final entry, marked settled, was dated the day before the theft. Miss Marple slipped the ledger into her handbag, her mind connecting it to Lady Beatrice's confession of her debt and Mr. Vance's pressure to sell the necklace. The ledger was a significant find, suggesting that Mr. Vance's financial hold over Lady Beatrice might be at the heart of the theft. Yet Miss Marple suspected it was not the whole story. The midnight meeting pointed to Miss Price and Timothy as key players, and the key she had glimpsed suggested a hiding place within the villa. She thought of a Chipping Norton seamstress, whose hidden ledger had revealed an embezzlement scheme, and wondered if Miss Price's quiet efficiency masked a similar cunning. That afternoon, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, engaging Colonel Hartley in conversation about his military days. His anecdotes were gruff but revealing, and she noted his mention of a disgraceful affair involving a fellow officer's debts, a story that mirrored his own mutterings about honour. When she gently inquired about his time in the billiard room on the night of the theft, his moustache twitched, and he changed the subject with a brusqueness that confirmed her suspicions of unease. Mrs. Duval, passing through, paused to adjust her hat, her movements deliberate, and Miss Marple noted the absence of the pearl earring she might have expected to see. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea a dark expanse below, the midnight meeting, the ledger, the key. These were pieces of a puzzle, and she felt the pattern taking shape. The Worthington star was not merely a prize, but a symbol, its theft tied to the ambitions and fears of those within the villa. Timothy's nervousness, Miss Price's secrecy, Mr. Vance's greed, Mrs. Duval's haste, Colonel Hartley's pride. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her patient observation, knew that the truth lay in their intersection. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needle silent as she contemplated the next move, certain that the following night, as Miss Price had whispered, would bring the mystery closer to its resolution. Chapter D. Issue 7. The Truth Unravelled. The drawing-room of Villa Serena was hushed, its heavy velvet curtains drawn against the evening light, casting a warm glow from the chandelier over the assembled guests. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her small figure framed by the marble mantel, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. Yet her presence commanded the room. Lady Beatrice Worthington, seated in a high-backed chair, looked to her with a mixture of hope and trepidation, while the others, Mr. Hugo Vance, Mrs. Clara Duval, Colonel Rupert Hartley, Mr. Timothy Wren, and Miss Eleanor Price, sat in a semicircle, their faces a gallery of unease. The Worthington star's theft had hung over the villa like a storm cloud, and Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, was ready to dispel it. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice soft but clear, "the disappearance of the Worthington star is no simple theft, but a carefully woven tapestry of motives and opportunities. I have observed much in the past few days, and I believe the truth is now clear." Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved from one guest to another, noting the tightening of Mr. Vance's jaw, the flutter of Mrs. Duval's fan, and the nervous twitch of Timothy's fingers. She produced the silver cufflink, its HV initials glinting in the light. "This was found in the garden, near the rose bushes," she said, her tone mild. "Mr. Vance, you claim to have lost it days ago, yet its polish suggests it was dropped recently, perhaps on the night of the theft, when you were not, as you said, merely smoking on the terrace." Mr. Vance's smile was thin, but he said nothing, his silence as telling as any protest. Miss Marple turned to the ledger, which she drew from her handbag. "This records payments from Lady Beatrice to you, Mr. Vance, for a failed investment. The final entry, marked settled, is dated the day before the necklace vanished. You had pressed Lady Beatrice to sell the star to clear her debt, had you not?" Lady Beatrice's sharp intake of breath confirmed the truth, and Mr. Vance's eyes narrowed, though he remained silent. "But you did not act alone," Miss Marple continued, her gaze shifting to Mrs. Duval. "The smudge of red lipstick on the library desk matches the shade you favour, and the pearl earring found near the bookshelf, yours, I presume, suggests you were there when the necklace was taken." Mrs. Duval's fan stilled, her face paling beneath her rouge. I lost that earring weeks ago," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple recalled a Chipping Norton actress whose dropped handkerchief had betrayed a similar deception. "Yet the theft was not your idea," Miss Marple said, turning to Miss Eleanor Price, whose composure faltered for the first time. "Miss Price, your quiet efficiency has been noted by all, but it conceals a sharper mind. I overheard your midnight meeting with Mr. Wren on the terrace, where you spoke of the necklace and a plan for tomorrow night. The key Mr. Wren dropped, I believe, unlocks a safe in Lady Beatrice's study, where the star is hidden, awaiting your departure." Timothy's face flushed crimson, and he looked to Miss Price, who sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's voice grew softer, almost regretful. "Miss Price, you orchestrated the theft, using Mr. Vance's greed and Mrs. Duval's desperation to your advantage. Mr. Vance, indebted and ambitious, saw the necklace as a means to secure his financial future. Mrs. Duval, struggling to maintain her lavish lifestyle, was persuaded to assist, perhaps believing she would share in the profits. Mr. Wren, infatuated with Mrs. Duval, was your unwitting tool, manipulated into retrieving the key and aiding the plan, unaware of its full scope. Colonel Hartley, his moustache bristling, interjected, 'Preposterous! What motive could Miss Price have?' Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and steady. 'In Chipping Norton, I once knew a quiet woman who embezzled funds out of resentment for years of being overlooked. Miss Price, you have served Lady Beatrice faithfully, but your ledger entries suggest you knew more of her finances than you let on. Perhaps you saw the star as a chance to secure a future free from servitude, a final act of defiance against a life of invisibility.' Miss Price's hands clenched in her lap, and then, with a suddenness that startled the room, she rose. 'Enough,' she said, her voice low but steady. 'You're right, Miss Marple. I planned it all. The necklace is in the safe in the study. Mr. Wren placed it there, thinking he was helping Mrs. Duval. I meant to take it and leave, start anew somewhere far from here.' She sank back into her chair, her face a mask of resignation. Lady Beatrice, tears in her eyes, rose and crossed to the study, returning moments later with the Worthington star, its sapphires gleaming like captured stars. 'I won't press charges,' she said, her voice trembling, 'but you must leave, Eleanor, and never return.' Colonel Hartley muttered about justice, but Lady Beatrice's decision was final, and Miss Marple, with a nod, approved her mercy. Mrs. Duval, pale and silent, excused herself, her Paris plans now urgent, while Mr. Vance's cold stare promised future reckonings. Timothy, head bowed, murmured an apology, his infatuation shattered. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fireplace, her knitting untouched. The Worthington star was restored, but the villa's harmony was not. She thought of Chipping Norton, where a stolen locket had unravelled a family's secrets, and reflected that human nature, with its greed and longing, was the same everywhere. The truth had been found, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet observation of small things. A cufflink, a ledger, a whispered word. With the mystery solved, Miss Marple fell to the familiar satisfaction of a pattern complete, her mind already turning to the journey home. Chapter 8. Homeward Bound. The steamer bound for England cut through the Mediterranean's gentle swells, its decks bathed in the soft light of an autumn afternoon. Miss Jane Marple stood at the rail, her shawl drawn close against the sea breeze, her eyes fixed on the receding coastline of Monte Carlo. The glittering villas and azure waters faded into a haze, yet the memory of Villa Serena and its tangled web of secrets remained vivid in her mind. The Worthington Star, restored to Lady Beatrice Worthington, had ended one drama, but Miss Marple knew that the ripples of human folly would linger long after her departure. Her fellow passengers, a mix of tourists and expatriates, chatted about the casinos and beaches, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She reflected on the case, her fingers absently tracing the handle of her knitting bag. The theft of the sapphire necklace had been no mere crime of greed, but a tapestry of human weaknesses. Miss Eleanor Price's quiet resentment, Mr. Hugo Vance's calculated ambition, Mrs. Clara Duval's desperate need for admiration, Mr. Timothy Wren's naive devotion, and even Colonel Rupert Hartley's prickly pride. Each had played a part, their motives as familiar to Miss Marple as the petty jealousies and hidden longings of Chipping Norton's villagers. She thought of Miss Price, whose confession had revealed a woman trapped by years of servitude, her cleverness stifled until it found expression in a daring theft. Mr. Vance's cold pragmatism, so like that of a Chipping Norton solicitor who had once swindled a widow, had driven him to exploit Lady Beatrice's debt. Mrs. Duval, with her theatrical flair, reminded Miss Marple of a village seamstress whose flirtations masked a fear of fading beauty. Timothy's infatuation was not unlike young Tommy Pierce's blind loyalty to a wayward friend, and Colonel Hartley's bluster echoed Major Thompson's need to assert his relevance. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, was a constant, whether played out in a grand villa or a humble cottage. The journey home was uneventful, the steamer's rhythm soothing after the intensity of the past days. Miss Marple spent much of her time in a deck chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a shawl, its intricate pattern a mirror to her thoughts. She had declined Lady Beatrice's offer to stay longer, sensing that her hostess needed time to restore order to her household. The Worthington Star would grace the charity gala, and Monte Carlo's elite would whisper of the scandal that never was, thanks to Miss Marple's discretion. Upon her return to Chipping Norton, the village greeted her with its familiar rhythms, the church bells tolling, the postman's bicycle creaking along the lane, the scent of baking drifting from Mrs. Bantry's kitchen. Over tea in Mrs. Bantry's cosy parlour, Miss Marple shared only the vaguest outline of her adventure, her eyes twinkling as she deflected her friend's eager questions. "It was a pleasant change, Dolly," she said, stirring her tea. "But people, you know, are much the same everywhere. A little greed, a little fear, a touch of longing. It's all quite familiar." Mrs. Bantry, ever curious, pressed for details, but Miss Marple merely smiled, her thoughts drifting to the cufflink in the garden, the ledger's secrets, the midnight whispers on the terrace. She had unravelled the mystery not through grand heroics, but through the quiet observation of small things, as she always did. The Worthington Star was safe. Miss Price had departed in disgrace, and the others would carry their private burdens forward, as people do. Miss Marple's work was done, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. As she returned to her cottage, the dahlias in her garden nodding in welcome, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. The world of Monte Carlo, with its glamour and intrigue, was behind her, but Chipping Norton, she knew, held its own mysteries. A missing brooch, a whispered rumour, a glance across the village green, any could spark the next puzzle. With a contented sigh, she settled into her armchair, ready for whatever secrets the village might bring to her door, her mind as sharp as ever, weaving patterns from the threads of human nature.